Kenyan, as you might have guessed, and my journey in the area of asset building or family wealth started off in St. Louis when I was an MSW student at Washington University in St. Louis. And I was very interested in how families generated wealth and what that meant for their wealth, for their health behaviors and their health outcomes. So that's why I started off in social work, looking at asset building. And so what happened after I graduated with my PhD, my very first study in New York, where I worked for 5 years, again was in Kenya, and it was a study that we decided to conduct to test the feasibility of IDA programs for orphan and vulnerable children in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware of what an IDA program is, an individual development account. So, oh, look at that. Several years ago, in the 90s, Dr. Michael Sheridan came up with a very simple, elegant proposal that poor people could save just as well as middle class and high-income Americans. Nobody believed him. And he said it was as simple as this. The reason that middle-income individuals can save and accumulate assets is because we have created around ourselves institutions that make it easier for us to save. True or false? How many of you get paid in cash? See what I mean? You have direct deposit into your bank account every 2 weeks or every month, and that makes it easier for you to save. You have a 403b, 401k account, that makes it easier for you to save for your retirement. So he argued that one of the reasons poor people couldn't save was because we hadn't put around them these institutions that facilitated savings. And he came up with this concept of an IDA, an individual development account, where we would seed accounts for low-income families, match any savings they put in, and then basically open up financial institutions to them to allow them to accumulate assets. Now, that started off in St. Louis, Missouri in the 90s. It went it's now global, and went all the way into sub-Saharan Africa. So my very first study was a feasibility study to look at whether IDAs, match savings accounts could work in sub-Saharan Africa with low-income families, families impacted by HIV and AIDS, or families that were taking care of children who had been impacted by HIV and AIDS. So I went in, did my little feasibility study, and a very interesting theme emerged that I hadn't thought about. And a lot of these women, and most of the participants of that study were women who either had a HIV diagnosis or had an AIDS diagnosis, while low income couldn't work also because of their medications or their health conditions. They all kept speaking about this concept of inheritance. I am very concerned about what I am going to leave for my children when I pass on. And they worked really hard to get their kids into private schools, which are very expensive, but sometimes do better than public primary schools in Kenya. And they kept talking about inheritance. What will I leave for my children? And I came back to America and I thought, oh, that's interesting. I had never thought about assets that way, that there's an inheritance component. So I thought, interesting. So my second study, back in Kenya again, about a year and a half after that, I went in and conducted a phenomenological study. It was very simple. I got groups of HIV-impacted individuals, heads of households together. And we started talking about the concept of inheritance. What does it mean for you? Are you thinking about it? What are the cultural ramifications of it? And how are you planning inheritance for yourselves and for your children? Interesting findings I found from that as well, that women at the intersection of HIV and poverty were most vulnerable to having their wealth misappropriated or taken away from them, either after they passed away or after their husbands passed away. And again, these families kept saying that we have assets, we have worked hard to accumulate assets, but we are not sure that these assets will then pass on to our children after our death. So I said, that's very interesting. Because when you look at how we conceptualize asset building in the United States, it's all about accumulating assets. Not only in the United States, also think about micro-lending, microfinance programs. We work very hard to get women into micro-lending, get them started a business, and get their kids sent to school. But we never think, what's the step after that? What will this woman be able to preserve the assets that she's accumulated? Does she have the asset rights to to leverage them for the next asset down the road? We've never asked ourselves those questions. So that's where I came in, and I thought to myself, these IDA programs, which we currently now have in Uganda, are interesting. We're helping families accumulate assets. But these are the very same vulnerable families that after the death of a head of household or after the death of a parent, those assets are taken away. So I thought, why don't we create a little sub-intervention that goes into these big IDA programs that educates families or puts families in a position to actually leverage and preserve their wealth. So that's the study I'll be talking about today, Uridi study, which was testing a succession curriculum intervention in Kenya. So I'm going to start off real quick with institutions and asset building, talk a little bit about the study, and then next steps. Now, I will say, however, that I do not, in this particular colloquium, I'm not presenting all the findings from Uridi study. I'm just taking a small component of the focus group discussions that wasn't touched on in the quantitative piece and talking about that. Okay, are we all good? Now, do we know where I'm headed and why I'm doing what I'm doing? Okay, good. So, a couple of definitions. I think we all know this, but I always like to throw them up. SSA, Sub-Saharan Africa. When I talk about OVCs, I'm talking about orphaned and vulnerable children. People living with HIV, positive living or living positive, that's VLHIV. When I talk about customary law in this particular presentation, I'm talking about unwritten patterns of social behavior which are communally enforced. Now, they're not always unwritten. We do have some tribes that have clans that have actually sat down and codified some of these laws. In this presentation, generational wealth transfers, intergenerational wealth transfers, inheritance succession will kind of be used interchangeably. And property grabbing, misappropriation, when I talk about that, just have that in mind. That's when the relatives and non-relatives coerce individuals into giving up rights and control over property. Okay, so let's start with basically the theoretical foundation of my work. So this is the asset building paradigm that again was proposed by Michael Sheridan in the 1990s, and it's very simple. He says that institutional constructs and institutions, when we talk about institutions, we're talking about the rules of the game. These are purposefully created rules that lead to a certain outcome. That institutional constructs, individual constructs, all inform savings and investment action. There's a subcomponent of intergeneration and generational transfers, and that those then lead to asset accumulation. So basically what we're saying is this. If you have access to, let's say, a financial institution, you have access to, for immigrants, a lot of us, it's access to a credit history. That facilitates your ability to save. When you look at individual constructs, your social networks, how much you know about the financial system, psychological variables, and your economic needs, those also inform your savings and investments actions. Generational wealth transfers, the money that you get, whether it be a house or cash from a parent, grandparent, or a sibling, that would also inform your savings and investment action, and also the accumulation of assets. Now, so what I'm saying is this, that this theory, again, developed primarily using Western literature, ignores the fact that in sub-Saharan Africa, not all our institutions are formal, some of them are informal. And we have to ask ourselves, how are people navigating the juxtaposition of informal and formal institutions, right? So when you have a country such as Kenya that has a succession law, the succession law of 1972, that is codified, and we know that I, as a woman, have the right to inherit from my father, but I'm also from the Kikuyu tribe. It's pretty clear that girls don't inherit, boys inherit, right? I'll one day be married off, so why bother giving her a piece of land? It's a waste anyway. So how do, especially vulnerable populations, so think about low-income women, women who probably don't have a means of earning income, women who have a HIV diagnosis, who already are dealing with the stigma of HIV, how are they able to navigate that environment, right? Where the informal institutions, where formal institutions exist that protect them, but that informal institutions are more easily accessible. I don't know if that makes sense. So think about it this way. If I am a married woman in Kenya, customary law marriage, right? So we probably don't have a certificate. He paid dowry and moved in, we had 5 kids, good to go. If he passes on, right, and his brothers come and get his death certificate, and I've actually had this come up in data, brothers get the death certificate, process the death certificate, go to court, and take all the land that belongs to me and my children, right? It's expensive to go to court. If I don't have an income, how do I fight him, right? So I think that's basically what's missing from currently our discussions about institutions and asset building in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll focus a lot today on institutions, and I'll also focus a lot on intergenerational transfers of wealth, okay? So real quick, I've already mentioned these institutions, formal institutions, statutory law, policies, regulations. I've mentioned that Kenya does have, when we're not talking about inheritance, the Succession Law of 1972, and we also now have a new Marriage Act, the Marriage Act of 2014, that gave men, polygamy is now really legal. It used to be legal, now it's really, really codified legal. And what does that mean for women who are in a marriage where a woman has co-wives when it comes to divvying up property? What does it mean for her children? Do we divide up the property based on the number of children you have, or do we divide the property based on the wives? What happens there? And then we have the informal institution, customary laws and norms. Again, under under African customary law, we have about 40 tribes in Kenya. I think every one of them allows for polygamy. Every one of them is not gender neutral. It gives more preference to boys. It, again, gives preference to gender and to age, right? So you can already see from this narrative that you can begin to pinpoint the people who are going to lose out at the end of the day, right? When we talk about vulnerable groups, again, Kenya, patriarchal social structure, let's just talk about sub-Saharan Africa. Property rights are tied to a male head of household. So a lot of discussion about where can you leave a relationship and what can you leave that relationship with. And kind of having assets and property tying women to relationships that they probably shouldn't be in. Property grabbing has been noted, has been found in sub-Saharan Africa. This is when people come over, take a property that belongs to children or belongs to widows. Limited property rights, this still exists, where I might have access to an asset in the household, right? So I'll tell you a story. So some of the data we're collecting, we had a whole range of assets that we'd ask participants, do you have access to A, B, C, and D? And we'd ask women, for instance, do you have a cow in the household? And the woman would say, yes. Who does a cow belong to? And she would say, it belongs to me because I milk it every day. But then we'd have to probe, do you have rights to the cow? And she'd say, no, my husband has the rights to the cow, but it belongs to me because I milk it every day. So those are limited property rights, right? Where you might have access to an asset, but do you have the rights to leverage it? Do you have the rights to sell it? And then misappropriation of assets, and again, this usually happens a lot with often and vulnerable children. HIV and AIDS, although this was not a big finding in this particular study, I always think it's important to talk about it, mostly because of the stigma and discrimination that comes with a HIV diagnosis, right? So in my past studies, having women talk about, and when we buried my husband, my mother-in-law packed all my things and told me to go back to where I'd come from, and I left the land and the cows and the cattle with that family. So stigma and discrimination when it comes to HIV and AIDS does play a role in the misappropriation of wealth in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so in summary, that's basically all I've said, right? Disenfranchisement of widows and children, misappropriation of assets, widows stripped of wealth after the death of a spouse, grabbing of property belonging to individuals impacted by HIV. And when I talk about grabbing of property, it can be violent or non-violent means. Women and girls unable to exercise full control over household assets that rightfully belong to them. Okay, so we've already talked about the case study of Kenya, talked about that. So now my question is, how do families navigate this environment? And that is why we, a couple of years ago, went back and did this study in rural Kenya, because now I was very interested. We have been talking about income generation and asset building for a really long time. But are we equipping the families we work with to navigate these formal and informal institutions? And that was Urithi testing a succession curriculum with low-income Kenyan households. These are some of the aims that I think are pertinent to this particular presentation. We developed and implemented an asset protection curriculum that was based on Kenyan succession and customary law. So what I did was I went back to Kenya, worked with a legal firm. We went through the laws, we wrote up a curriculum, we edited it to make sure that the language is accessible. So I have it in English and I have it in Kiswahili. We might develop it in Kikuyu, which is a predominant language spoken in the area I'm going to talk about. The curriculum touched on various issues. It touched on the benefits of planning for inheritance before you die, talking about the myths, when you think about the cultural myths around, if I write a will, I'm just inviting death. And that's something we've heard a lot, that I don't want to write a will because then I'm just going to fall down and die. Having the lawyers talk about those myths and give examples of people we know who went as far as digging a grave and never died. So really that doesn't pan out, does it? We talked about the importance of will making. We talked about the different forms of wills that an individual can make in their household without having to pay a lawyer to do it and have them stand up in court. So we talked about written wills, we talked about oral wills. We also talked about guardianship for children, how it is you go about selecting a guardian and making sure that your children are protected after you die. We actually talked about the word death, because at the beginning, nobody actually mentions the word death. We have all these different euphemisms for dying that we use. But by the end of each day-long seminar, people would actually be using the word death. Let's call it what it is. No, it's death. We also talked about trusts and how to plan for your business. But that was a very small module we did spend time on. Another aim of the study was to examine participants' knowledge change regarding succession. So we had pre- and post-test questionnaires before they went in for the one-day workshop, and then after they went in for the one-day workshop, have they changed? Do participants now know how to write a will that would stand up in court, and do they think that's a good idea? And examining behavioral change, measured as engaging in inheritance planning. And I will tell you, for most focus groups, when we ask people, so has anyone thought about or started writing a will, the women would shoot their hands up, and then they'd turn around and look at the men like, what? No? Yeah, so the women were actually very receptive to this particular seminar. So real quick, this was in Nyandarua County. This is one of the 47 counties in Kenya. I picked it for, it's rural, and because it's, people still have a significant amount of land holding in this particular county. So I thought it might be interesting to look at this in a region where people have capital intensive assets, which are land and cattle. It's a rural area. I will say this, and we might come back to this in a minute. Those are the Aberdare Ranges right there. My thing is not working. So those are the Aberdare Ranges right there. And on the other side of the ranges, so the people that live in this land are known as the Kikuyu. On the other side of those ranges, the Kikuyu tribe continues. But also in the focus groups, the women who had come from the other side of the ranges and gotten married in Nyandarua County would tell very different stories about their mother's experiences with assets and land ownership on the Murang'a side. And I would want to posit that could be because we have more land in Nyandarua County, right? So Nyandarua County, these highlands, they were known as the White Highlands. This is where the British settlers lived and farmed prior to when we were colonized. And they had huge tracts of land. So what they did is that they concentrated everyone in small villages on the other side of the ridges. So land is tighter on the other side of these mountain ranges than it is in Nyandarua County. And so in Nyandarua County, people still actually have land that they can divide and give to their children, which is not the case with the other side. So for the whole entire study, we used a convergent parallel design, where we collected quantitative data and qualitative data. So testing out the intervention, does this curriculum work? Is it well received in a community such as this, and how can we change it? So we collected quantitative data through surveys and qualitative data through focus groups. These were analyzed and compared separately and then interpreted. So what I'm going to present on today is actually just a sliver of the qualitative data, and I'm not touching on the bigger study, which was the evaluation piece. I always like to talk about methodological rigor, especially when we talk about qual data, because I think it's very important. So one of the first things I did prior to studying the study was to create a panel of language experts. So these were people who were well versed in English, Kiswahili, which is a national language, which we are all supposed to speak, and we do, and then Kikuyu, which is a tribal language in that one particular area. And to have this 3-person panel translate and back translate the surveys and the focus group and actually even the curriculum material, and to have all my interviewers conversant again in Kiswahili, Kikuyu, and English. And the reason I do that is very simple. It's the same as saying, do you know how the dialectic differences between Americans and the Brits? It's kind of like that, right? That the Kiswahili and English will differ depending on what part of the country you're in. So I also needed someone who's well versed in Kikuyu to kind of pick out those differences and make sure that the language we're using is accessible. For the qualitative data, this was really interesting. We always started off in Kiswahili, but then we would weave in and out depending on who the participants were. So for some of the younger focus groups, we would predominantly just speak in English. But then we would weave in and out across 3 languages. And to maintain a clear audit trail, like I always tell my students, keep a journal, remind yourself what you thought about when you asked that question, what it felt like in the room, and kind of what are some of the keywords participants were speaking, because then that becomes very key when you're analyzing qualitative data. So let's just look at the focus group discussions. The 5 questions we looked at: evaluating the curriculum, how could we improve the curriculum? We talked about barriers to succession in that particular region of the country. We identified factors that facilitate succession planning in that region. And then the key question, would you, after this seminar, engage in inheritance planning? How did we code the data? We had 2 independent coders. So I am native, so I was coder number 1, and when my doc student was coder number 2. And what we did was both identified overarching themes. I identified more themes than she did, I think basically because I was so close to the data and I'm more aware of the cultural implications of some of the things that people are saying. But over and all, we pretty much matched up. And then in the second phase, I used Atlas TI to look for patterns in the data. So back to these focus group discussions, I will tell you this, that because we needed buy-in from the community, one of the things I did was to first pilot what we call the pilot for the curriculum, to see if the leaders of the community would be receptive to it. So the very first focus groups that we had were definitely older. I think the average age was close to 60 years old. And this was because we used snowball sampling to pick out the former chiefs of the area. We had a gentleman called the chairman, who was the chairman of the local diabetes, I would call it a club, local diabetes group. So kind of the people who are the key contacts, the people who are leaders in the community, those were the people we first piloted with. So the first 2 focus groups were older, and I keep calling them the older participant focus groups, just to differentiate them from the general study population, which was significantly younger. What's interesting here, of course, we had more female than male, although I was pretty impressed that we got that many number of men coming in to participate in the study. A lot of people have at least primary education, and that's why I said we can all speak Swahili, because that is a language that's taught in primary school. We had married, divorced people. The number of children per household was 2.2 with a range of 0 to 9. So what are the results? So this is what people say about intergenerational wealth transfers in Kenya. That there is a breakdown in the process. So let me contextualize this by saying, when I talk about intergenerational wealth transfers, they're not talking about it from a cultural perspective, where your forefathers passed on land to your father, and then who will then pass on land to you. And that's how we retain, and that's how we build wealth in the community. But both participants, both the younger and the older and younger participants, noted that there was a breakdown in that process, and that it has proven detrimental to individual economic well-being. We'll see that in a minute. So according to the older participants, They blame this breakdown in the wealth transfer process. The reason they're hesitant to give wealth or to give land or to give cattle to their children due to drug use and poor financial decision making, which then creates doubt about how well they'll be able to manage family wealth. According to the younger participants, though, they blame it on their parents and they say, they're not talking to us about wealth, they're not teaching us how to manage wealth, and they're waiting until they die, and then I find myself with a 10-acre farm. I don't know what to do with it, right? So those are some of the contradictions that came out from the data. Now, I will say this, the overarching thing I heard is that there is still this individual level factors to the breakdown and structural level factors to the breakdown. We'll see why in a minute. So let's start by setting the stage. Wealth is a family legacy. And for qualitative data, I like to leave my quotes up there so you all can interact with them, right? So you can read them for yourselves, but I kind of highlight the words that I think are key. We get to inherit because of the words that were spoken before us. By words, we mean the words of your forefathers. I have this land, I'm giving you this land, and I want it to benefit my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren. That's what it means. So I will inherit from my parents, my children will inherit from me, and the cycle continues. And that was a person from a youth group who said that. There's also this idea that even if you have wealth that wasn't inherited from your father, whatever you have accumulated now should belong to your children. And I will say there was kind of a sense of entitlement in the younger youth groups, where I remember in one conversation, the young man saying, well, he needs to give me land because I didn't ask to be born. I got born, so the land belongs to me. It's kind of a sense of entitlement, which was very interesting. But I really was a young woman who said, there is one who got property through his hard work, and there is one who inherited it. You are supposed to think, what am I going to leave behind for my children when we die? So you're going to work hard and acquire your own wealth so that your children can have something to inherit. So it's the youth also telling themselves, in as much as I got cattle from my parents, in as much as I got land, I also then need to leverage it and make sure that I have enough to leave for my children after I'm gone. So let's look at the breakdown. So what's happening? So participants agree that wealth should devolve from a father to, well, from a parent to a child. And we agree that there is a historical connection, especially when it comes to land, that there is a spiritual connection you have to land that you shouldn't sell and should belong to your parents. But then there is that breakdown where parents aren't devolving wealth to their children, and let's look at why. So this is from an older participant. What I want to say is this, that it's good to distribute your property, but even those who agree to distribute their wealth, they don't release it immediately, meaning you don't give it to your children when you're still alive. Why? They divide their property by retaining it with them because they know that if they see that property being misused, then they're going to leave a curse. Now, I remember who said this, and it was one of the older participants who was religious, and the conservative religious, and the reason you could tell that was because of the way she was dressed. You know, she had on all white and she had a headscarf, and it's a sect that's so religious that they have their own title. We don't even call them by their names, we call them by the title of the sect. And so when she started talking about curses, the scandal in the room, oh my God, Jesus wouldn't like that. But it's a discussion we have to have, right? So again, what it means when somebody says, I'm going to leave a curse, that's a very cultural, spiritual connotation to your property, right? Which I thought was very interesting. The juxtaposition between Christianity and African traditional religions. And I think I have a breakdown. Yes, I do. Okay. So this is another interesting quotation, which I like, because it signals for me one thing, that in as much as the older generation is blaming the youth for their inability to protect family wealth, there's also an aspect of structural forces, meaning the lack of employment and the lack of income generating opportunities available to youth in this particular region. So the breakdown, according to this older participant, is usually caused by joblessness. You know, so your children are educated, but they cannot They do not have opportunities to generate income, so there's a lot of idleness, there's a lot of drinking. There's actually a quotation I have where one of the younger women says, yeah, there's actually a lot of drug use around here. And so it's wasting time and wasting money with your friends. So this is what this older participant said that I think is very interesting. So you will just live your own life, and when you die, your family can share out your property the way you shared your father's property out. Now that is what the problem is, because if we do not have a clearly written will, a mandate, that says this goes to this person and this goes to this other person, that's where a lot of the property is lost, where a lot of property grabbing happens, and where a lot of the adjudication in the courts are very expensive, and families have lost a lot of wealth that way, just fighting it out in the courts. Is it working now?
No.
Yeah. So, the parents decry the children sell property, but now listen to what the younger women say. This is what they say. Let's say I'm given 1 acre and I don't have money to build. So I sell a quarter of that acre so I can build a house and live comfortably with my children. So some people sell because they're not living a good life. So that's the first contradiction I found between the older, another contradiction between the older and the younger generation. In that the younger generation don't view selling land as a negative. If I need money for school fees, if I need money to build a house, if I need money to start a business, I will sell off that quarter acre of land and use that money to generate more assets, okay? Another female from the same group says this, yes, especially the women. You know, men don't believe that women can inherit. Most women are afraid because they don't know if their brothers can take whatever you have once your parents have passed away. There you go again. We have statutory law that clearly says that girls can inherit the same as boys. We have the very same rights. But these women are saying, I'm not sure about my brothers. I'm not sure if I'll be able to retain the acreage my mother and my father gave me after they're passed on. So this is what the women do. Yes, most men disagree that with their sisters inheriting anything. So after being given land, we usually sell it and buy land somewhere else. So again, contradicting what the parents think is misuse of land, the girls are saying, this is for my own safety and for the safety of my children. I would much rather have my inherited piece of land sold off to someone else, take that cash and buy a piece of land somewhere that only has my name on the title deed. Does that make sense? I thought that was fairly interesting. So now let's look at the next steps. So we evaluated the curriculum, and I was also very interested in wanting to know, so what else can we do to address the issue of wealth misappropriation and wealth loss? And participants noted financial socialization, gender-neutral wealth transfer rules, and will rights, which we did. So there's a financial socialization model, I think, by Gudmundsson and Dane that explains what financial socialization is. So I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember when we had checkbooks and my parents would show us how to write a check, balance a checkbook at the back. That was financial socialization, right? I remember I had a little passbook and you'd go to the bank and put in like 2 shillings, 5 shillings, and you'd sign it and you'd balance it and you're so excited. So that was how my parents taught me how to handle money, right? So what these youth are saying is that there has been that breakdown where their parents are not teaching them how to handle capital intensive assets, right? So when you think about financial socialization, it doesn't have to be an explicit conversation. This is how you do this is how you do that. It should be purposeful, but it can also be observing your parents in their day-to-day activities and how they handle wealth. So what the youth are saying is that there is that breakdown, that it is the parents' responsibility to show us what do I do with 10 acres of land, right? If you start a business, how do I run the business? And not waiting until it's too late and then children inheriting assets they don't know how to do with. I like this quote, this quotation from this person from the youth group who's saying, the parent, he's not showing me the importance of investing and how he acquired his property. I don't know how hard it was for my father to acquire this piece of land. He's talking about all these things that his father had to do to acquire property, but he's saying parents aren't teaching us that. most parents don't bond with their children, and to me that was an indicator of the socialization process, where parents are not going out of their way to sit down and teach their children how to become savvy consumers, savvy financial consumers. We are lacking the discussion between parents and children, and that's why we are becoming useless and wasting our parents' resources. I like that quotation. Gender-neutral laws, I think this has been said ad nauseum. Again, we do have laws in Kenya. We have a beautiful constitution, a very progressive constitution. Our laws, except for the Marriage Act of 2014, can be said to be very progressive. But these gender-neutral formal laws we have seem to obfuscate what's actually going on the ground. And that's what participants are saying, that people need to know that girls can inherit just as well as boys. And this is an older participant who says, if all the Kikuyu tribe were daughters, if we had no more sons, would we go looking for other tribes to inherit our land? The answer is no. We would have to give those assets and those resources to our daughters. And so that's what she's saying. So if I give birth to only girls, I will still give my property to my daughters. So creating an environment where these formal rules and laws, which are gender neutral, which value me just as much as they value my brother, become more commonplace. So the next one was will writing or will making. I think I started off by saying what the curriculum taught. And it taught these individuals. So one of the critiques we had in our past data was participants saying it's so difficult to hire a lawyer. It is so expensive. I can hardly feed my children, and yet this lawyer wants 20,000 Kenyan shillings to write me a will. So these are some of the issues that were dealt with in that curriculum. That an individual with individuals to testify that they saw him or her sign the will, that makes that a valid will. We also talked about oral wills. So this is a person saying, as for me, I saw the importance of writing a will. I am going to write a will because I am a widow. Did I tell you about most of the women saying, I'm thinking about it and I'm going to write a will? So if I don't write a will, the problem which affected my children at the time her husband died is going to continue affecting them. So I feel that I'm going to have to write a will, right? So there's a lot of conversation, especially among women who've gone through that process of having their household wealth taken away from them, not wanting their children to go through the same thing. So we talk about behavioral change. So so this is somebody else who hadn't written a will, but she was, and this was a difficult quotation to translate. I have not written it on paper, but I am trying to write it in my mind. That doesn't quite translate into English. What she means is she's mulling it over and thinking about what would go into that will. And then she says, my child was even asking me, what kind of education are you learning? And I told him, I am going to learn how I want you to live once I am gone. I am thinking of how I am going to write and plan my future and the future of my children. I also mentioned that by the end of the process, we were more freely now talking about death and not talking about death in euphemism. So, in conclusion, what does this particular set of data tell me? That inheritance is both a right and a responsibility, but there are spiritual and cultural connotations attached to especially the capital intensive, the land and the cattle that family has. There is consensus that intersecting individual structural factors contribute to this breakdown in the intergenerational wealth transfers, and that participants suggest financial socialization, gender-neutral decision-making, and a facilitated access to legal mechanisms as a way that we could begin to ameliorate some of these issues. And that's it. I don't know if you guys have any questions or anything I can clarify. Question?
Yeah, I noticed that you distinguish between formal law and informal law. I call that customary or something. You can write something into law, but paper is patient, right? And it seems to me, from what you're telling me, that Kenya, and I suspect this is the case in a variety of African, but also Asian countries, and probably even South American countries, that this notion of the rule of law does not exactly override what is considered customary. So you can have a very progressive law, or set of laws in Kenya, But in tribal law, and that is something else, we're talking hundreds of years here, and some of those tribes are actually quite ancient monarchies, right? Way back. So my question is, tribal law frequently overrides formal law, is that correct?
No. Legally, on paper, no. So,
Yeah, on paper, but in practice, because...
yes. So, okay, let me clarify. Let me put it this way. Statutory law overrides all customary law. So if we went to court and with my co-wife, and she had a will written by our late husband, and all I had was an oral will said by my late husband, and let's say that even if the oral will is still valid, that means he died within the 3 months of making that oral will, her written will win out over the oral will. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
technically it supersedes, but now here's the issue. Statutory law is expensive to interact with. It costs a lawyer, it costs you transportation to the capital city to go to the court, and of course the case is continued, and it costs a lot of money. And that's why people gravitate towards a customary law, because all you need is the chief and the head man and whoever else. And
But the idea has disseminated across Kenyan society that women have equal rights under the law than men, as men.
yes,
Ah.
yes, and people would say that, you know. People would say, you know, according to the Constitution, I have the same rights as my brother, but then I'm also afraid of him, so I'm going to sell the land and move somewhere else. Yes, so we do know that girls have the same rights as boys in Kenya.
Kind of related to that, I'm curious about how the knowledge of like formal law kind of influences the power balance between disadvantaged group or sort of lower status groups or smaller groups. So, for instance, in like large parts of Latin America, land inheritance is so old that there isn't a written document. So developers in like the Baja Peninsula would go and get essentially phony documents, come back and say this land is ours, and the family that's been living there for several hundred years can't prove that it's theirs because it's been passed down generationally. To what extent or how does that play out where kind of manipulation or knowledge of, you know, formal statutes, formal structures is used as a mechanism for power?
I have a paper out there on corruption. That's what you're asking, right?
Well,
I mean, that's what it is. Let's call it what it is.
But you also mentioned like the death certificate. Even within a family, they built the knowledge of how to go process the paperwork to show it. Even if it's not explicit corruption, it's still it's utilization of the formal system to override kind of the informal statute.
Yes. So, I mean, that does occur. And at the time we were conducting the pilot study, there was actually a case in that region for a man who'd passed on, and he had several wives, and more wives were showing up. And they had to bury him late at night, I guess, so that the other family couldn't write the death certificate issue, because then that gives you the right to say he was ours, because look, we got the death certificate, so all this stuff belongs to us. But yeah, you're right, that especially in Kenya, and I can say this comfortably, that corruption is an issue. I think we're ranked 131 out of 147. Like, man, we got this, you know? We know how to work the system, which is very unfortunate, because again, when you think about corruption and how resource intensive it is to bribe someone, right, to get that piece of paper that gives you access to that land, and then you can kick out that second family. So again, the vulnerable families who cannot access these institutions legally or illegally are always at a disadvantage when it comes to wealth transmission. Question?
I have a question. You touched on the role of religion a little bit. I'm just curious because in the Indian subcontinent, I think inheritance laws are dictated by, what's the religion? There's a, inheritance law that was developed by the Brits 50 years ago based on whether you're Muslim, Hindu, or a Christian, so and so. So, and there is a disconnect between the religious laws and what's actually practiced in rural areas. Because some of the gender discrimination is actually done through those practices, right? So I'm just curious that whether there is any, what role religion plays in terms of property inheritance and all that, and also whether there's an urban and rural sort of difference.
Now so about religion I can't answer too, because I haven't seen that in my data, and specifically when it comes to inheritance. But let's talk about the urban-rural divide. So these studies that I conducted in Kenya started in urban and peri-urban areas, so think about it, just because I live in the capital city doesn't mean I don't have a piece of land in my rural ancestry home, right? Doesn't mean that I don't have a cow or a goat still stashed away with my mother or my mother-in-law. But looking at these two sets of data, the one I collected in Thika, which is peri-urban, and now in Nyandarua County, which is rural, the landscape is still the same, right? The women are still talking about the same issues. The men are still treating women the very same way. So whereas in Nyandarua County, we would talk in terms of cattle, of sheep, and of land, in the urban areas, we're talking about things like household goods, right? And I remember one woman in Thika saying, don't look down on this issue just because the only thing you own is a tea thermos. That's an asset that you could leave to your child. So they're not as capital intensive issues or assets as we would think about in rural Kenya, but the issues are still mirror each other.
Njeri, thanks for the talk. I had a question about documentation. You said there was 47 counties in Kenya. Does each county have a place to record titles to land? And are you supposed to write it down when it gets transferred? Is there a place to do that?
Yes.
The government provides that?
Yes, there is. There is.
So
we have a Ministry of Lands.
In each county? You don't have to go?
National.
No, I mean, can you go to a county office and do that?
I honestly think so.
Okay.
I don't know, don't quote me on that, because every search I've ever seen was run in the capital city. So I don't know how it works county-wise. And I will say this about counties in Kenya, we just got them in 2010. So we're still trying to figure out who owns what, who owns the health system, who owns the system, but don't quote me on that. But I do know we have the Ministry of Lands, and the searches I've seen are done at the Ministry of Lands in the capital city.
So what about death certificates? Is it required when somebody dies to tell how old they were, what they died of, and how much property they own, and who got it?
But no, not the property, just the death certificate just declares you dead.
You don't,
and
no
now
property
we can go
goes on the document?
No. But I mean, think about it. If you have a death certificate, it's the same as having a birth certificate. You own that person. I mean, that person belongs to you, right? Your next of kin declared on that death certificate. So that becomes very interesting. And I will say that these issues cut across social-economic groups. So my research has focused a lot on low-income populations, but we have heard anecdotal stories of these happening to very wealthy families in the country.
So you mentioned that there were women who came to the focus groups and then seemed to be really interested in writing the will. But I'm interested in maybe the men's attitudes towards writing the wills, because a woman can't pass on the land if their husband hasn't either included them in the will or their children. I'm not sure if you found anything as far as their kind of men's intentions.
So not for this particular data, but for the study I conducted in Thika. Now so I don't know how many of you do qualitative interviewing and your use of self in the room as you're interviewing. And I remember one focus group I had was men only focus group. And it was fascinating. So I was off at the corner asking the questions and retreating and just listening to them talk about the women in their lives. And so I remember one of the gentlemen saying, my land, I have land, but I have 2 wives, but I've had to separate them because these wives are always fighting like cheetahs and they're just going to destroy all my property. And there's that conversation going on and infantilizing women and not giving women the proper status that they deserve in the household. So not for this particular data, but for a previous study that I did in Kenya, that sentiment did come out where I own the property and I will decide what my wives or what my children get. Not speaking to the fact that, you know, women work and contribute to the household and contribute to buying some of these assets, and yeah. So if you're interested, I could share a paper with you from that study that really goes in depth to what the men's attitude towards the women when it came to yeah.
That gets to a question, actually it's more or less parallel to the question I was going to ask, which is about potentially if women are interested in writing the wills, but the men aren't, that's kind of your, for in terms of policy or seeking thing, trying to increase the take-up of wills. That seems to be the kind of the barrier there. So, and based on research you've done, kind of what efforts have been taken to kind of circumvent, you know, the male conservatism, I guess, is the barrier there.
So I think Kenya has very good public service announcements, especially when it comes to gender. The government is very committed to creating gender neutral laws, looking at what we've done in our parliament, where we now have the 1/3 gender rule, that parliamentary committees and members who sit in parliament, that we are now increasing women's representation in the public sphere. And I think that's what's going to cut it. When more of us see women as a norm, as leaders, that kind of elevates our position, I guess, in men's eyes, right? That they're really equal if they're legislating the same way as men. But I will, to Kenya's credit, we have very good public service types of announcements where we try to create, circulate the information that girls are just as good as boys. So I will say that. For my country, I will say that.
I would like to make a comment about that. It's very hard. It's so deep-rooted to change some of the practices. I mean, in Bangladesh, we have had 2 women basically running the country for the last 40 years. 34 years. But we haven't, I mean, we have seen some progress, but not a lot.
Well, I was also curious.
Yeah.
I think it's
Even the speakers.
in India's the barefoot colleges that started those training women for around engineering. They go back and they do solar electrification in their cities and their villages, and kind of changes the power dynamic between men and women. But that was just for the motivation to that question.
I'm kind of curious if any changes in this data, any changes in you came up as participants got older, and especially among older participants. Because I can think of a lot of examples where when you're young, you think your parents are doing something annoying, right? Like they're not teaching me well, and like they're not spending enough time talking to you about this. But then when you're parents, you have your own reasons for not doing that. So I guess I was wondering among the older participants if you saw any sort of like change in opinion, or when their claims to power or the advantages they would get from having a certain perspective change as they get older and as they have different rights and property, then their opinion changes too.
I didn't see that transition. I didn't see that trajectory of thinking change. But what surprised me, though, was that women, whether they were in the older group or the younger group, were categorically clear that women should inherit. So that's the one constant I found. So where men in the older group would be like, But then if I write, this is interesting. If I write a will and then I have to say about my other girlfriend, wife who lives in some other, right? But for the women, both the younger and the older women, categorically clear throughout the entire study that women should inherit. I will write a will so my children don't go through what I went through. So I found that very interesting, that was like constant for all groups of women. But for that, what you're saying about the older population changing how they thought about the youth, I didn't see that change.
Well, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Next question.